Cam, what's
Hi, Dr.
happening?
Turek. How's it going?
He's a PK. There's his dad back there. All right.
So I wanted to ask what your response would be to progressive Christians that say the Bible does not address homosexuality, and if it does, then it's taken out of context.
Yes. Russell, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So quickly, do you have a thought, a response to the opposition or attack on Paul's use of the word arsenokoitai in Romans and in Greek when he's describing homosexuality? There's been an attack lately from two fronts that I've seen, which is the word's made up, apparently, that you don't see it in the Greek. I'm sure you've heard this. And that he's actually not describing homosexual but abnormal relationships outside of that. I heard Melissa Doherty talk about this recently, but I didn't know if you could speak more in depth.
Well,
Today, we're diving deep into the controversy surrounding the Bible and homosexuality. Recently, two college students posed questions about homosexuality and the Bible, challenging the assertions of so-called progressive Christians who claim the Bible doesn't address it or that it's taken out of context. We'll examine key passages like Mark 7 and Romans 1, and discuss the historical and cultural contexts to uncover the truth. Stay tuned to see if these modern interpretations hold up against traditional biblical exegesis.
I would ask them, how do they deal with Mark chapter 7 and Romans chapter 1? Because Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about these being indecent acts. He talks about these behaviors being sinful. Not saying this is in the context of temple prostitution or any of that. He's talking about the acts themselves. And it's well known that in the first century that there were people who did live in, or did have so-called monogamous homosexual relationships, and because some are trying to say, oh no, this is a new thing. No, they had that back then, and it still was not something that God approved of. Also in Mark chapter 7, Jesus says that it's not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, it's what comes out of a man. And he says several things, including theft, sexual immorality. Well, sexual immorality was the category under which everything in the Old Testament and the moral law regarding sex would have been put under, meaning that adultery, homosexuality, fornication, bestiality, rape, any sexual activity outside of the intercourse of a man and a woman in a marriage relationship was considered immoral by Jesus when he talked about that category, sexual immorality. So when people say Jesus never talked about this, first of all, that's not true. He did when he talked about sexual immorality. It would be like somebody saying, as the Babylon Bee put it, Jesus never said anything about felony home invasion. Oh, does that mean it's okay? No, he didn't talk about felony home invasion in those words, but he said that theft was immoral. And under theft, you would put felony home invasion. So, yes, Jesus talked about those things. And look, I think another way of looking at this, Cam, too, would be to say to people, let's go back 100 years. Did anybody 100 years ago, or the whole 2,000 years of the church until the past 10 minutes, did anyone in the church, or anybody even outside the church, looking at the Bible, ever suggest that same-sex relationships were permitted? Nobody. This is a very recent development, right? Now, you could see how people in the past looked at the Bible and misunderstood slavery, because slavery in the Old Testament, even though they used the word slave, was really indentured servitude. It wasn't the kind of awful slavery we had here 160 years ago. You could see how people would be confused over that. You can't see how people would be confused over sexual immorality in the church history. It's only now that people are saying this, which means it's the culture driving this. It's not biblical exegesis driving this. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Yes. Russell, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So quickly, do you have a thought, a response to the opposition or attack on Paul's use of the word arsenokoitai in Romans and in Greek when he's describing homosexuality? There's been an attack lately from two fronts that I've seen, which is the word's made up, apparently, that you don't see it in the Greek. I'm sure you've heard this. And that he's actually not describing homosexual but abnormal relationships outside of that. I heard Melissa Doherty talk about this recently, but I didn't know if you could speak more in depth.
Well, I'll tell you where to go. Go to the Stand to Reason website, str.org, and look for an article by Alan Schliemann. Alan Schliemann, because he talks about this. I don't have all the technical details in my head right now, but he does. And I think if you search for the word, or for the, search for 1946.
Do you know how to spell that name?
Just go to str.org, search for 1946, because that's the title of this article that Alan Schliemann,
Right.
Schlemon, writes.
Okay.
And it has...
The Bible does not address homosexuality. It is incorrect to claim that the Bible does not address homosexuality. The Bible does contain specific references to homosexual behavior. In the Old Testament, passages such as Leviticus 18 verse 22 and 20:13 clearly condemn same-sex relations. In the New Testament, Romans 1 verses 26 to 27 and 1 Corinthians 6 verses 9 to 10 also address the issue of homosexual acts. These passages, among others, demonstrate that the Bible does indeed address the topic of homosexuality. It is important to consider the historical context in which these passages were written. In ancient Jewish and early Christian communities, sexual ethics were understood differently than they are today. Homosexual behavior, along with other forms of sexual immorality, was viewed as contrary to God's intended design for human relationships and sexuality. If the Bible does address homosexuality, it's taken out of context. To suggest that the Bible's references to homosexuality are taken out of context requires a closer examination of the passages in question. By carefully analyzing the context, we can understand the intended meaning of these texts. For example, in Leviticus, the prohibition against same-sex relationships is part of the Holiness Code, which outlines various moral and ethical guidelines for the Israelite community. The context of these passages emphasizes the importance of sexual purity and adherence to God's laws. Similarly, in Paul's letters to the early Christian churches, including Romans and Corinthians, he addresses various issues related to moral behavior. The references to homosexual acts within these letters align with broader themes of sexual ethics and moral conduct. It is worth noting that the traditional interpretation of these passages has been consistently upheld within Christian interpretive tradition. Throughout history, these texts have been understood as referring to homosexual behavior. This understanding is rooted in the principles of biblical exegesis and the broader theological framework of Christianity. Aren't those passages about other forms of sexual immorality and not consensual same-sex relationships? While it is true that the Bible addresses various forms of sexual immorality, it is important to understand that these passages encompass consensual same-sex relationships as well. The ancient understanding of sexuality differed from our modern understanding, and the Bible's prohibitions were not limited to non-consensual acts or abuses of power. How do you reconcile these interpretations with a loving and inclusive God? Christianity teaches that God is both loving and just. While God's love is unconditional, His love does not negate His moral standards. The Bible distinguishes between loving the person and addressing behaviors considered sinful. God's desire is to guide humanity towards a life that aligns with His perfect plan and design. Why should we follow ancient texts on contemporary issues? The Bible is considered a sacred text, believed to contain timeless truths and principles that are relevant to all generations. While cultural and societal contexts may change, the moral teachings of the Bible provide a foundation for ethical decision-making. It is important to approach the Bible with a discerning heart, seeking guidance from the Holy Spirit and the wisdom of Christian tradition. What about other biblical laws we no longer follow? The Bible contains various types of laws, including ceremonial, civil, and moral laws. The New Testament addresses the fulfillment or continuation of these laws in light of Jesus' teachings and the establishment of the New Covenant. Christians believe that Jesus' sacrificial death and resurrection brought about a new era, where certain laws were fulfilled and others continue to guide moral conduct. The Bible does address homosexuality, and the passages pertaining to it should not be dismissed or taken out of context. Understanding the historical and cultural context, as well as the interpretive tradition of Christianity, helps provide a comprehensive understanding of the Bible's teachings on this topic. As Christians, we strive to approach these discussions with love, respect, and a commitment to biblical truth.